According to the logical positivists, all meaningful statements are verifiable. Let's clarify two things. First, it's not exactly all meaningful statements. It's just all meaningful statements that are not tautologies, or what Hume called relations of ideas, i.e., all meaningful statements about the world outside the mind, about extramental reality. Second, it's not verifiability in fact, but in principle. The statement, "There is a golden mountain on the far side of a planet roughly the size of Earth, located on the far side of the galaxy," cannot be verified with our current technology at least, but it is verifiable. A.J. Ayer, in his book Language, Truth, and Logic, explains what verification in principle means. It means that you can state what sort of experiences would count as evidence for or against a belief, and obviously this one is verifiable in this sense. All you need to do is imagine what it would be like to find evidence of such a golden mountain. You're in a spaceship on the far side of the galaxy, orbiting a planet the size of Earth, and you look down on the planet and observe the golden mountain. And so, roughly, verification of a theory is the finding of relevant evidence consistent with a theory, and the positivists say that all meaningful statements about the world outside the mind are verifiable. Now, let's talk about the history of philosophy a bit. Let's rewind. David Hume, the empiricist philosopher of the early modern era, seems to be the most strong influence on logical positivism. Hume says that all our knowledge is either a relation of ideas or a matter of fact. Relations of ideas are things like the truths of mathematics and geometry. They are true, but they do not describe the world outside the mind. They are literally and only relations of ideas. 2 plus 2 equals 4 is true because our minds automatically connect the idea of 2 and 2 with the idea of 4. That's why it's true, and that's all there is to it. It does not describe any reality. The statement 2 plus 2 equals 4 just describes the way our minds think about these things. Relations of ideas are one category of knowledge in Hume. The other category is matters of fact. Matters of fact are all known from sensory experience, and all their content derives from sensory experience. And Hume goes so far as to suggest that anything which is not a relation of ideas or a matter of fact is meaningless, and books about such things should be consigned to the flames. Perhaps he's exaggerating, but he does at least say it. Now, the logical positivists are a movement in early 1900s philosophy which are influenced by Hume. They were in their own day extremely influential. They pretty much dominated the discipline of philosophy in the English-speaking world, in North America, and in Britain. Their main idea was this verification criterion of meaning. They were trying to state this idea from Hume more clearly and draw out its implications more completely. They claimed that metaphysical statements were not meaningful. Neither were religious statements, and neither were moral statements. So closely associated with logical positivism was the thesis of emotivism. And this is the thesis which states that moral claims don't have any actual meaning. They're just expressions of our emotions. As Ayer says, to say that stealing is wrong is not to say that there is some fact about stealing. It's just to say stealing gives me bad feelings. Now, logical positivism, despite being very influential, died out surprisingly quickly later on in the second half of the 1900s. One reason it died out was Karl Popper. Karl Popper argued that science does not rely on verifiability, but on falsifiability. And in this way, he undermined positivism. Thomas Kuhn, another philosopher of science, argued that science was not fully objective. It was not fully subjective either. That's another position from another philosopher of science I won't get into here. But Kuhn did say that science is not wholly objective. And in this way, he helped to undermine logical positivism, which was committed to the thesis of total objectivity in science. And then there's also the situation with Willard Van Orman Quine and the later writings of Wittgenstein. Interestingly, the early writings of Wittgenstein had been influential on the logical positivists, but the later writings of Wittgenstein, a book called Philosophical Investigations and some other works, went in the same direction as Quine in Two Dogmas of Empiricism, an article by Quine described elsewhere on this channel in the Articles in Contemporary Philosophy playlist. Quine and Wittgenstein analyzed language and analyzed our ideas as having a certain holisticity. Positivism had this idea that our thoughts can be chopped up into little units, and each unit could be tested in sensory experience. Quine and the later Wittgenstein thought language and thought were more holistic. There are no individual units of thought that could be tested. Now, another reason positivism died out, besides the influence of these other philosophers, is that logical positivism was simply wrong. It relied on the verification criterion of meaning, and that was its central claim. The whole point of logical positivism was to articulate this verification criterion and explain its implications more clearly. Well, the verification criterion is wrong. Here's an interesting way of looking at it, borrowed from Alvin Plantinga's essay, Advice to Christian Philosophers, where he notes that if logical positivism is correct, people who thought that they believed in God were deluded about the fact. Now, Plantinga goes on to say something else. He just mentions this in passing, but let's pause and look at this remark. It's right. It's very important. Understand the significance of this. The statement God exists, according to the positivist, was meaningless. And so, as A.J. Ayer explains in Chapter 6 of Language, Truth, and Logic, the statement God does not exist is also meaningless. A denial of a meaningless statement is just as meaningless. The statement God exists, the statement God does not exist, and the statement borrowed from Lewis Carroll, "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe," are all equally meaningless. They all mean exactly the same thing, which is precisely nothing at all. Now understand the significance of this. Atheists deny the existence of God. But if logical positivism is true, then the claim that there is a God is meaningless, and so is its denial. Atheists deny the existence of God, but logical positivists deny the existence of atheists, because no one can make a meaningless statement and actually believe it. Again, atheists deny the existence of God, but logical positivists deny the existence of people who believe in God. So if logical positivism is correct, the Pope does not believe in God. Neither does Billy Graham. Neither does the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, or any of the other billions of people on this planet who are Muslims or Hindus or Christians or Jews and who think that they believe in God. And Nietzsche and Daniel Dennett and Christopher Hitchens are not, strictly speaking, atheists. Now, this doesn't seem right, does it? Consider these argument patterns. If A, then B, A, therefore B. If A, then B, not B, therefore not A. Those are both good patterns. Now consider these arguments using these patterns. If the verification criterion of meaning is true, then the Pope does not believe in God, and Nietzsche is not, strictly speaking, an atheist. The verification criterion of meaning is true, so the Pope does not believe in God, and Nietzsche is not, strictly speaking, an atheist. Second argument. If the verification criterion of meaning is true, then the Pope does not believe in God, and Nietzsche is not, strictly speaking, an atheist. The Pope does believe in God, and Nietzsche is, strictly speaking, an atheist. So the verification criterion of meaning is not true. Those are both perfectly good arguments. In their form, the premises guarantee the conclusion, and they have the same first premise. And the question is, which argument has the more probable second premise? What evidence could the positivists possibly have for their criterion of meaning that is more powerful than the evidence that the Pope believes in God or that Nietzsche is an atheist? Whether the Pope is correct or whether Nietzsche is correct is entirely irrelevant to this point. The fact that the Pope and Nietzsche disagree on something, on the existence of God, is precisely the point. If the positivists are correct, Nietzsche and the Pope agree on the existence of God, or at least they don't disagree. Well, they agree that 'twas brillig and the slithy toes did gyre and gimble in the wave, because that's all it means to say that God exists or does not exist. Just to say it doesn't mean anything. Now, another problem with logical positivism is that it appears to have been falsified. Now, verification is the finding of relevant evidence consistent with a theory, and falsification is the finding of relevant evidence inconsistent with a theory. Some may say, and I have said, that the verification criterion of meaning is self-contradictory, but I'm not so sure we should say that. It would be self-contradictory if it cannot be verified. But it seems that it can be verified. All you have to do to verify a verification criterion of meaning is to find some meaningful propositions that satisfy the criterion, and that means propositions that can be verified. And you have to not find any meaningful propositions that can't be verified, but that'll do it. If you don't find any that cannot be verified and find some that can, you have verified your verification criterion of meaning. So the bigger problem with the verification criterion of meaning, as I see it, is not that it cannot be verified. I think it can. Incidentally, maybe it cannot be verified in sensory experience, in which case it would still be self-contradictory. But let's look at this other problem for now. The problem with the verification criterion of meaning is not that it can't be verified, although parenthetically maybe it cannot be verified on its own terms for verification. The problem is that it has been falsified. There is at least one meaningful proposition which cannot be verified. Plantinga advises Christians that it's perfectly all right to say, I know that my theological beliefs have meaning, and if they can't be verified, then obviously this criterion of meaning is mistaken. But it's helpful to look at a problem lurking at the very heart of logical positivism. There are what I have been calling X-beliefs. See the earlier videos on the topics playlist in this channel. An X-belief is any belief which is necessary for learning anything about the world from experience, but which itself is not learned from experience. Now, logical positivism, in its verification criterion of meaning, depends on the belief that verification actually happens. Now, Bertrand Russell, in his essay on logical positivism, at the very end of the essay, points out that there is an X-belief, and it's the principle of induction. This is the belief that we can learn something about what we have not experienced from what we have experienced. And the principle of induction is essentially the principle that verification is possible. And you cannot verify that without arguing in a vicious circle. So, the verification criterion of meaning is falsified because the principle of induction, or more generally, the principle that verification is possible, cannot be verified. It must be accepted without being verified, as Russell says. And that's the problem with an empiricism that is too absolutist in its claim that all knowledge derives from experience, as, again, Russell says at the end of his essay. The verification criterion of meaning is falsified by the existence of the principle of induction or by any other X-belief. Now, there is a little bit more to say. The verification criterion of meaning is not correct, but that does not mean that some weaker thesis is not true. Consider this. You could posit a verification criterion of truth and say that all true statements about the world outside the mind are verifiable, or you could posit a verifiability criterion of knowledge, say that all knowable statements about the world outside the mind are verifiable. Now, these would seem to both be problematic theories based, again, on X-beliefs. If you can't know that verification works, or if you can't know the principle of induction except by verifying it, I don't see how you could know it at all, because verification relies on these things. But consider this. You could posit a verification criterion of science, and you could say that all scientific statements about the world are verifiable. And that seems to me to have enormous plausibility. For my part, I credit the logical positivists as having this very respectable theory on the nature of science. Now, I cannot endorse this theory because I think Karl Popper has shown that science does employ falsifiable theories, and it seems to me that there are other patterns of scientific reasoning than just verification. See the What is Science video on this channel, on this playlist, the topics playlist. But let's try one more. What if Popper or someone like that is right and the verification criterion of science is mistaken? It might still be true that some other field of knowledge, or maybe some subfield of science, has a verification criterion of meaning that fits it. Try archaeology. Archaeology, by definition, involves dealing with ancient artifacts and relics. Maybe you could say that every archaeological statement can be verified by the study of these relics. So, in summary, the logical positivists were a big tradition in 1900s philosophy. They believed in a verification criterion of meaning. They were wrong, and the logical positivists are pretty much all gone now. But a verification criterion of something less than meaning, perhaps of science, or of some field of science, or some other field of learning, ain't a bad idea. Don't throw out all possible verification criteria with the dirty logical positivist bathwater of the verification criterion of meaning. A lesser verification criterion might well be correct.